Hello friends, welcome to ePathshala. Today we will be discussing nation and nationalism in pre-modern Japan. Japan is one of the prominent nations in the world today and exerts significant influence on the global affairs. It has achieved phenomenal economic and industrial success despite the constraints of natural resources and hence serves as an inspirational example for many Asian nations. It is also a nation of highly educated people who enjoy high standard of living, which is evident from its much higher standing in the list of Human Development Index. Japan is a small island country of captivating beauty, geographically isolated from the rest of the world and inhabited by one of the most homogeneous populations. The ethnic homogeneity of Japanese people remains remarkable because it has not been diluted by the influx of people coming from other lands. Japanese people share the same myth and history, speak the same language, and have lived in the milieu of the similar tradition and culture. Japan also accepted Buddhism and reconciled it with the native religion, Shinto. This union of Shinto and Buddhism remains a characteristic feature of Japanese religious and spiritual consciousness. In addition, they have a nation's head in the emperor who serves as a symbol of state and the unity of the people. The penchant of the Japanese people for their nation has expressed itself in the rising wave of nationalism at various junctures of history and helped Japan overcome the crisis it faced in the stride. Japan has successfully maintained, to a greater extent, an undiluted culture and tradition, despite its awe-inspiring modernization that is visible today. Japan has also had its own experiences of trouble, travails, crises, and the days of upheavals, but lived through all this in the course of history. It looks like a miracle how an insular country lacking in vital natural resources went on to become a giant economy in the world. These accomplishments make us wonder about the specificity of Japan and its people, how Japan established itself as a nation, and how the spirit of Japanese people gave rise to nationalism, which in turn shaped such a course of Japanese history. What are the factors that make Japan a unique nation and its nationalism a formidable force to be reckoned with? How Japan evolved in its formative days and how Japanese nationalism manifested itself in times of crisis, thereby setting a precedent to be followed in the unfolding of time. In order to find the answer to these pertinent questions, an understanding of the emergence of Japan as a nation and the role of primordial Japanese nationalism are imperative. So in order to understand Japanese nationalism, first of all, we need to understand the factors of Japanese nationalism. Nationalism is understood through two different factors, namely objective and subjective factors. Objective factors are important for understanding primordial nationalism, and they include geographical confine, myth and history, language, ethnicity, and other factors. We know that Japan is an island country surrounded by the ocean and it do not share its land boundaries with other countries. In early days, this factor almost isolated Japan from the rest of the world and helped Japan maintain its racial and ethnic purity because the influx of people into Japanese land by migration was very little or almost nil. Hence, the possibility of miscegenation of races was almost nothing, and hence Japan maintained a homogeneous population. Because of this, a strong affinity grew amongst Japanese people. Another important objective factor is myth and history. The idea of Japan as a nation is also structured by its myth. The mythical Emperor Jimmu, the first emperor of Japan, was supposedly the direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Emperor Jimmu, who laid the foundation of Japan on 11th February 600 BC, is considered, in a way, the father of Japanese populace. And that is why 11th February is celebrated as the foundation day of Japan. The present emperor is part of the unbroken chain of the divine lineage that started from Emperor Jimmu. The emperor is also considered as the highest authority of the Shinto religion because he derives his divinity from the direct linkage to the sun goddess Amaterasu. Another important unifying objective factor for Japanese people is their language. Japanese language evolved through Chinese and Ryukyuan languages or dialects. Chinese ideograms called kanji are heavily borrowed from China, but later a new pronunciation system was constructed by Kukai or Kobodaisei with the use of Sanskrit syllables. With passage of time, Japanese was linguistically unified and a distinctive character of Japanese language evolved. Though dialects existed, but linguistic conflict remains unknown to Japanese history. Another important factor is religion. Shinto, which is also interpreted as the way of the gods, is the indigenous religion practiced by the people of Japan since the ancient period. It is much like animistic faith, focused on the rituals and other practices to placate the kami, which means gods. Shinto was not an organized religion, and it lacked the philosophical canon considered essential for a mature religion. This lacuna was filled with the advent of Buddhism in 538 AD, when Buddhism was introduced in Japanese soil. The pious Prince Sotoku Taisho adopted Buddhism and made serious efforts to spread it to the populace of Japan. The reach of Buddhism was further widened when the Emperor Shomu, a devout Buddhist, constructed provincial temples and nunneries in Nara period called Kokubunji and Kokubun-Neji, respectively. These temples and nunneries were used as a center of learning and spreading the teachings of Mahayana Buddhism, which originated in India. The reconciliation between Shinto faith and Buddhism brought a new integration amongst people of Japan, which further consolidated Japanese nationhood. Another objective factor is ethnicity of Japanese people. Japanese identity is also constructed by the shared ethnicity of the people of Japan. Though here the term ethnic Japanese is used to signify a particular ethnic group, including Yamato, Ainu, and Ryukyuan people, yet the Japanese ethnicity has been heavily dominated by Yamato people, and Ainu and Ryukyuan people constituted a minuscule minority. In addition to these factors, some other factors also play a great role in making Japanese nationalism a great force to be reckoned with. These include the ethical conduct of Japanese people, their ethos, and their traditional ways of behavior. Though these values underwent changes with time, but they remain distinctive of Japanese culture. Now let's have a look at primordial nationalism in Japan. The nationalism is studied through primordial and modern approaches. Here the focus will be on primordial approach because in pre-modern Japan, the objective factors were the determinants of Japanese nationalism. Primordial factors are important for understanding Japanese nationalism in pre-modern times because we don't have many examples of subjective factors coming into play. Objective factors are directly related to the primordial nationalism, which, as I already explained, include geographical confines, myth and history, ethnicity, religion, and other factors. As far as the subjective factor is concerned, it is expressed through some manifesto or constitution or any written material, any written document which expresses the aspiration of common people. The first constitution of Japan was prepared by the Prince Shotoku Taisei. Prince Shotoku took control of the political affairs of the state of Japan and introduced a series of reforms, of which the most important one is the 17 Article Constitution. He introduced this constitution in the year 604, which functioned as the code of conduct for the Japanese people. This brief constitution adopted Confucian ideals for governance and statecraft. It made the imperial institution as the supreme authority and its command binding for all citizens. Buddhism had lasting impression on the prince, as explained earlier, and he envisioned it as a great cohesive force that could unify the mass with one and the same philosophy and practice. The efforts of Shotoku to build temples and monasteries in large numbers stand testimony to the fact that he wanted to spread Buddhism to every part of Japan. The contribution of Shotoku Taisei in the nation building is evident in three aspects. He laid the cultural, political, and most importantly, religious foundation of Japan. This instilled a sense of oneness and belongingness in Japanese people. People of Japan started identifying with the nation and their common destiny. This effort was further extended by the Emperor Shomu, who ordered to build Buddhist temples and monasteries in all the 66 provinces of Japan, thus laying the foundation of Japanese nationalism. Once Japan was established as a nation and the seeds of nationalism were sown, it was only for the time to express Japanese nationalism, and such a moment came when Mongol invasion took place. Japan was first exposed to a grave foreign threat when Kublai Khan attempted to bring Japan in the fold of vast Mongol Empire. The first wave of Mongol invasion reached the Japanese shore in 1274. But before the Mongols could launch the attack on Japanese soil, a typhoon struck and destroyed the major part of the Mongol fleet. As a result, Mongols could not summon the strength to launch offensive, and Japan survived the most deadly attack coming from external world. This event was a shock to Japanese rulers and awakened them to the truth that they can be subjected to the foreign offensive and their territory will not be safe until they could wield the power to meet and subdue such attacks. But most importantly, this crisis allowed the surging wave of Japanese nationalism to be expressed. This brought whole Japan together as one composite unit against the foreign attack. Yet another attack by Kublai Khan was launched in the year 1281. This was another great force trying to subdue Japan and bring it into the fold of Mongol Empire. Japanese people were not in a position to meet this kind of challenge. They had no other option but to pray. They believed that Japan is a divine country protected by heavenly powers, and they extended their prayers to those powers. And incidentally, their prayers was answered again, and Kublai Khan's forces were once again destroyed by a typhoon. Japanese people felt that the divine power has come to their rescue. They called this typhoon as divine wind, which is expressed by the term kamikaze. It strengthened the belief of Japanese people in their divinity, and they felt that in future also any such attack will be thwarted by the divine power which is helping Japan at every stage. Another such moment When nationalism of Japan expressed itself came when the unification of Japan took place. In the warring state period, Japan was torn apart in internal conflict, which was solved by the three great people of Japan, namely Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. However, the final unification was brought by Tokugawa Ieyasu, who established Tokugawa shogunate in 1603. But the real consolidation was brought about by Tokugawa Iemitsu, the third shogun of Tokugawa dynasty. He is also remembered as a ruthless shogun responsible for crushing the Christianity and almost uprooting it from Japan. This incident denied Japan the possibility of nurturing religious diversity. In 1549, one of the great founders of the Jesuit order, Saint Francis Xavier, visited the island country, and a Jesuit order started missionary work in Japan. The problem that Christianity posed to Japan was its intolerance towards existing religion of Japan. It came in direct conflict with Buddhism, which was deeply entrenched in Japanese heart and mind. Another important objection that Japan had with Christianity was its denial of the divinity of the emperor. However, the influence of Christianity grew considerably in the peasantry class of Japan. Tokugawa Ieyasu was tolerant to Christianity during the budding days of his regime, but in 1606 his gaze turned against Christianity. He started issuing anti-Christian edicts and finally began to execute Christians by 1612. Missionaries were driven out of the Japanese territory and the native Christians were forced into apostasy or martyrdom. The final blow to Christianity in Japan came when the Shimabara rebellion of peasant Christians was crushed with full force. More than 20,000 Christian peasants, fed up with the religious persecution and economic oppression, resorted to rebellion in 1637-1638. They gathered themselves in the old castle of Shimabara in Kyushu. The rebellion was met with the brutal force of Tokugawa army that led to the massacre of Christians in the castle. After the fateful incident, Christianity lingered in Japan, but only in a clandestine form. After this, Japan followed the strict policy of isolation of Japan from the rest of the world in order to maintain the purity of Japanese culture, religion, and traditions. Another incident where nationalism has worked importantly is seen in national learning movement. National learning emerged in Japan as an independent intellectual movement against the dominance of Chinese philosophy and literature in Japan. The proponents of national learning believed that the dominating influence of Chinese learning instilled the sense of inferiority in Japanese people. They also maintained that the influence of Confucian thoughts have turned people servile, crafty, and cunning. Under Confucian influence, people have forgotten simplicity and the way of the heart, which needs to be restored. This stirred a movement dedicated to liberate Japan from pervasive Chinese influence that hindered the intellectual capacity of Japan and eclipsed its cultural importance. Pioneers of this movement were Kamo no Mabuchi and later his disciple Motto Norinaga. Norinaga advocated that once we can purge Japan of the contamination of Chinese influence, Japan can pursue the way of the gods, its ancient ethos. He laid emphasis on the continuing imperial dynasty of Japan and calling it as the gift of gods. He also emphasized about the people of Japan that they do not belong to shogun but to the emperor. Many scholars trace the roots of the Meiji Restoration in the ideals planted by the movement initiated by the national learning. Even the guiding slogan Son no Joi, meaning revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, while protesting against the unequal status between Japanese nationals and foreigners in the late Tokugawa period, was inspired by the national learning. Norinaga also believed in the notion of superiority of everything Japanese, including the literature. The national learning provided the impetus to nationalism in Japan by distinguishing Japanese intellectual creations from those of Chinese. The development of literature of a country is considered to be one of the important contributors to the identity of the nation and its nationality. Now we will come to the role of Japanese nationalism in bringing the fall of Tokugawa shogunate. The isolation of Japan from the rest of the world came to an end with the arrival of the Black Ships of America in 1853. The commander of this American expedition was Commodore Matthew Culbreath Perry. He met with the regional governor and handed him the letter of request from American President to the Emperor of Japan. The letter asked for the humane treatment of shipwrecked seamen, fuel supplies to the ships in dire need, and preferably some trading rights. Matthew Perry, in a decisive move, added one more page to this letter, mentioning that he will return in the spring for the reply. This letter served as a threatening ultimatum to Japanese rulers. Commodore Perry returned in 1854 and forced the shogun to come to the negotiating table. The shogun gave in without displaying much defiance and accepted the terms in the face of overwhelming strength of Commander Perry. The shogun and his counselors knew well that Japan cannot afford conflict due to economic and military inferiority. The Bakufu agreed to open two ports for American ships, namely Hakodate in Hokkaido and Shimoda on the tip of Izu Peninsula. However, the shogun remained reluctant to the commencement of commercial relations. The treaty was signed on 31st March 1854 and termed as the Treaty of Kanagawa. Similar agreements were soon concluded with England, Russia, France, and Netherlands. Many patriot Japanese interpreted it as an invasion by a foreign power on the Japanese soil. The shogun immediately turned a traitor in the eyes of these nationalistic people. They thought that the shogun has betrayed the nation by failing to protect the interests of Japan and has lost the right to rule it. The political consequence of the treaty proved to be the fatal blow to the existence of Tokugawa shogunate. The anti-Bakufu faction rapidly grew in strength as many nationalistic people aligned in support for the imperial court and gave the slogan of Son no Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Here barbarians meant the foreigners. Many young warriors called shishi, who came from the lower rung of the samurai hierarchy, came in support of the idea of imperial restoration. The nationalists placed their first loyalty to the nation and the Japanese throne. Yoshida Shoin, an extraordinarily intelligent shishi from Choshu, was the real voice and guide to the movement. Shoin was a loyal follower of the native religion, Shinto, and strongly believed in the divinity of Japan. Shoin started a school to instill in the heart and minds of young people the feelings of nationalism and willingness to serve the nation to the best of their abilities. This school produced nationalist future leaders of Japan such as Ito Hirobumi, Yamagata Aritomo, and Kido Koin. Shoin was later arrested and executed for trying to assassinate one of the counselors of Bakufu for signing the treaty with foreigners. Shoin left behind the legacy of supreme sacrifice for the nation, which became the ideal for many patriots to follow in coming years. Satsuma and Choshu, two powerful Hans, came together to overthrow the Bakufu. These two Hans had a large number of adventurous shishi who were willing and capable to take extreme actions to accomplish their objectives in the interest of Japan. The major difference between these two competing sides that proved decisive in the long run was the feeling of nationalism. The opposition forces lacked the spirit of nationalism and giving the supreme sacrifice for the nation, while the anti-Bakufu forces were fighting for Japan and willing to restore the power to the emperor again. In a 3-day battle at Fushimi, the final struggle between the two forces came to eventual conclusion. The anti-Bakufu forces, impassioned with the cause of protecting the nation, proved more able and efficient in suppressing the Bakufu forces. In the year 1868, the Bakufu forces surrendered, and the 2.5 century-old Tokugawa shogunate came to a crushing collapse. This was an epoch-making incident in Japanese history in which the emperor assumed the supreme authority. It is famously known as the Meiji Restoration in Japanese history. In the initial days of social evolution, people were bound with each other through the shared myth, legend, folklore, and their narratives. They developed a sense of oneness for living together in the same geographical confines and following the similar way of life and practices. The primordial approach holds that this was the period when the seeds of nation and nationalism were sown. However, the idea of nationalism properly emerged in the historical era of Japan when political structures came into existence. The nationalistic feelings of Japanese people expressed itself strongly during Mongol invasion. It also entrenched the idea of divinity of Japan in its people when Kamikaze supposedly helped Japan overcome the Mongol threat. Religious diversity was denied in Japan when Shimabara rebellion was crushed violently. The movement of national learning tried to preserve the pride of Japan by restoring the importance of Japanese literature and culture by rejecting Chinese dominance in these spheres. The nationalistic spirit stirred by the movement grew so strong that it toppled the Tokugawa shogunate and restored the authority in the hands of the emperor. The imprint of nationalism can be seen on the major incidents in pre-modern Japan. With this, we come to the end of this. Thank you.